I have a new method to evaluate.
Yo, what's going on, YouTube? Baka here from Meta World Gaming. Just want to start out by saying thank you guys so much for the warm reception that we got on the previous Heimerdinger guide. Everybody seems to really enjoy it, and I want to make an updated version of it to cover the changes that we have in patch 1.2. Big nerfs, big buffs. What are the changes to this deck? Did it get nerfed? Did it get buffed? It seems to be a very hot topic these days, and I'd like to answer a lot of questions from my perspective as somebody that's had a lot of success with Heimerdinger, played a ridiculous amount of matches with this deck with a very high win rate, got top 10 on North American Servers Master, created an EU account, and in 1 week, only playing 3 hours a day on that account, managed to hit top 100 Master, playing almost exclusively this deck. And we shifted from the old Claws of the Dragon list to a new list here recently, and we're going to be using this list going into patch 1.2, actually. So let's get into it. But just to try to explain the difference between our last guide and this one, we're going to be covering the changes in this guide and things that have updated in patch 1.2 rather than explaining how to play Heimerdinger here. I want to make sure that people understand the difference, and if you're a new player looking how to learn to play Heimerdinger and you've just never seen the deck before, or maybe you've played it a bit but you're not quite getting it, you're not getting the win rate that you were looking for, I would check out our other video. I'm going to have that link down in the description. Start there and then move back to here for the patch 1.2 updates. Unless you already feel pretty confident in your Heimer and you just kind of want to see what's new with the deck, then this is definitely the video for you. Also, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, follow everything that's linked down in the description below. We got the Twitch, Discord, all the socials. Definitely means a lot, and we really like hearing from you guys. If you have any questions after the video, feel free to leave a comment. We usually reply pretty quickly, but it's not perfect on YouTube as we have to check for all the comments. But if you catch us live on Twitch, we're going to be playing this deck a lot, and we can answer your questions live anytime. You can ask us whatever. It could be my favorite color, or it could be how to play Heimerdinger. It doesn't really matter. We will answer the question immediately. You can also go into a lot more detail too, or if it's a string of questions, I would say it's probably better to catch us live. But let's get into it. So the two big nerfs to this deck that people have been talking about, because this one is a super controversial topic of, is Deep Meditation a buff or a nerf for Heimerdinger? This card now costs 5 mana instead of 4 mana before, making the reduced cost version of this card cost 3 mana, which if anybody is familiar with Heimerdinger, 3 mana equals the best turret. That gives you your elusive turret, which is what this deck is definitely trying to do at any given time in the game, is get that elusive turret. It is definitely your most versatile, powerful turret that you can use to win the game and still generate blockers for cheap. Anything that you want, that elusive turret will do. So, that being said, the other nerf is Vi, which everybody can agree that this is a nerf, but how substantial is it? Some people believe the card isn't going to be in the deck anymore. Some people think that the card is still too powerful because of the exceedingly high win rate that it had before and how well it was able to answer everything, that 1 health really won't make a difference. And it's kind of somewhere in between. So there's definitely some substantial changes that were made with this 1 health lower on our Vi here, because we've seen time and time again that 5/5 stat line is just so big, so prevalent at the 5 mana and 6 mana cost that almost, so Vi before was just a guaranteed 2-for-1 almost every time. It was very, very hard to not get a 2-for-1 out of this card. But now if we're trading into 5/5s, our Vi actually dies, and before that was keeping our Vi at 1 HP. So now Vi is looking to trade on a smaller card first and then deal with the 5/5 after, rather than getting the 5/5 and then eliciting a 2-for-1 by opponent having to do something with our 1 health Vi. Not to mention all the other times that small increments of damage add up and our Vi lives at 1 HP. Another really common case is that you just attack 2 cards with 3 attack. Her tough reduces that down to 2, and then Vi would live at 1 afterwards, which is just it's a world of difference how many times our Vi is going to survive compared to before, considering how many times Vi was living at 1 HP, especially if you've seen a lot of gameplay with this deck. You understand that this card lives at 1 HP all the time. That's probably her most common resting health, of just, she's always at 1 HP, sometimes 2, but I think it is a substantial difference, but it's not enough to warrant not playing her. She's still most of the time going to get a 2-for-1. You're just going to have to work for it a little more, and it's not going to be quite as powerful at dealing on the board, but Overall, this deck really needs this stabilization tool right around the turn 5 mark that can press our opponent to be spending more mana into our Vi, or just dealing with the board, or dealing with the problem of Vi to keep up on board, and then that opens us up to play our Heimerdinger, as well as just getting us back into the game so that we actually aren't so far behind on tempo that we can't play the Heimer. So she's still very important. I don't think we're going to see any meta that's really going to make me want to take Vi out of the deck, but that being said, if the meta does shift very slow-paced, very controlling, we might actually see one Karma pop into the deck over the third Vi. Now, Vi, like I said, definitely will still remain in the deck, but the third copy might not be as necessary when we can add something as powerful as Karma into our deck, where that 6 mana change just doesn't really make a difference for this deck, because you're only playing Karma on turn 10. You never really need to tempo her out early, and you're not really concerned about cards like Will of Ionia bouncing it back to hand and preventing you from playing again. Like, you just play Karma and you end up just double spell burning them out. You're going to hold on to cards like Get Excited and Mystic Shot and use Karma as an alternative win con. However, Karma's too slow at the moment, or as it stood before patch 1.2 with all of the more aggressive decks. But now, if the meta seems to shift towards hard controlling strategies, then we could put in that one Karma. If the meta became entirely control decks, aggro decks just cease to exist, then maybe Vi would even just come out of the deck and just we'd go back to the old Heimer Karma list with, or maybe it'd be like 2 Karmas and 1 Vi or something like that. I really doubt that will happen. I do still think that aggro is very strong, just not nearly as broken as it was before. But I'll get into that a bit when we go talk about our overall strategy changes against those decks. But overall, I'm pretty sure Vi is going to stay in this deck at 3, and we'll just check back on this later. Now, some new additions to the deck that you might have seen us playing on stream recently, if you are a frequent viewer, but changes from our previous deck list, is it used to be 3 Claws of the Dragon, and now we are playing 2 Chempunk Pickpocket and 1 Key Guardian. Now, a lot of heads get turned about this one of like, why would you play this card over Claws of the Dragon? Claws of the Dragon can come and play for 0 mana. Does that effect even ever activate? What? Key Guardian, Omega Lol, like, why are you playing this card? Isn't this card hot garbage? And to put it simply, no, this card is not hot garbage. And yes, you do trigger this card's ability, and the 0 mana clause does not really matter, in short. But I'll get into that a little bit more here of, so what does Key Guardian offer for our deck? Well, this is preemptive protection on our Heimerdinger, and it's been testing really well on turns that you have early game, where Heimer does pass a lot of turns. But from turn 1 to turn 4, you often play 2 cards, and past like 2 of those turns, you don't really spend any mana. You almost always end up with additional spell mana that goes unspent, or some unit mana that goes unspent. So it's very, very easy to get this Key Guardian off earlier. Not only that, but it helps us cycle cards to get closer to our Heimerdinger when we don't have it, and can help us keep up on board as well by creating blockers that have barrier, which is a huge bonus against certain decks, of just being able to target something like Chempunk, Shadow Assassin, or Solitary Monk, and getting a free blocker can really tempo swing the game back into your favor for just a simple 2 mana card that also draws a card. But the preemptive protection on Heimer is, I cannot describe to you how broken it's been lately, of just having this card come and play with barrier, still having our 3 spell mana, and having our additional protection of Twin Disciplines on this card. It has been phenomenal, overperforming, and so versatile too, of just even when you don't target your Heimerdinger, like I said, all these other cards that we have, even Vi, targeting your Vi and she comes down on 5, especially now with this reduction in health, could be even stronger, still give us the capability to take out those 5/5s on turn 5 and lose nothing. And almost always Key Guardian is going to elicit some kind of additional card out of your opponent if they want to make a favorable play against any of our barrier cards. So another huge part about this is it almost always gives you a +1 in the form of the card draw, and then the barrier trading on some form of card. But not to mention the general Heimer strategy, if you've seen the previous video or any gameplay and just touch upon it, is we never play our Heimerdinger unless it is invincible. And what that means is that we play our Heimerdinger with consideration of every possible removal card that our opponent could have, and make sure that we've held up cards like Twin Disciplines or Deny or Spirit's Refuge or something to make sure that our Heimer lives through the turn. And then once we untap with full mana with a Heimerdinger, it's usually smooth sailing from there to be able to protect it, or even ignore the removal spell sometimes to just vomit our hand forming a massive board after our opponent has spent their mana dealing with Heimerdinger, and then just kill them and not care that our Heimerdinger died. But whatever the case is, you always start with play a Heimerdinger where it cannot die. And Key Guardian has just helped so much of just giving us mana that we can spend preemptively on a very solid protection on this card in the form of Barrier. Because this means we can still go into our turn 5 with a 5 mana for Heimerdinger and 3 spell mana for our additional protection, but with an extra layer of Key Guardian, making it basically impossible for this card to die unless your opponent was playing a card like the Obliterate card from Deep, and their guy is already deep at a 7/7, and we don't have anything else that we can really be doing about it because Twin Disciplines puts our guy to 6 health. It's one of the few ways that really happens. Or if your opponent has a ton of mana and has a source of 3 damage like Grasp or Gotcha or Get Excited, and then another card on top of that that is able to remove the barrier, that's just getting around the barrier. Not to mention if we had Twin Disciplines, though, in those cases, our opponent could sink 2 cards into our Heimer and it would still live. So the scenarios just shrink substantially. It's almost impossible for your Heimer to die. Cards like Vengeance maybe can still get it if you don't have Deny up, but you can always keep these in mind based on your matchups, and you should be able to more easily and more comfortably set up your Heimerdinger play. Moving on, though, to the Chempunk. I'm sure you are all... a lot of people are wondering about this card. They're like, really? Like, Chempunk, is this really better than Claws of the Dragon? Claws of the Dragon come and play for 0 mana. That kind of tempo for a deck like this seems incredibly important, and I feel like we're not really triggering that effect of the Nexus Strike on this Chempunk very often. And there are a couple major points to this. One, the Claws of the Dragon coming down for 0 mana was kind of hard to do already in a timely manner that made it effective, because once you started getting Claws of the Dragon down for 0 mana later on in the game, it didn't really have much of an impact, and a lot of times you were already in a winning position where you just didn't even need it. So if you were super far behind, it didn't generally save you, and if you were far ahead, it was completely useless. So no matter what, it just didn't do anything, and majority of the time you played Claws of the Dragon on turn 2 as a 3/2. That was our most common scenario, is we played Claws of the Dragon as a 2 mana 3/2 vanilla, just as a good way to deal damage in the early game. And I did touch upon this a lot in our previous deck guide, and we say it a lot on stream, of you kind of look at that card and that deck slot as a 2 mana 3 damage spell. That is what is intended to do. If it happens to deal damage to your opponent's face, then cool, like it's a notable bonus, but like it's never something that you're aiming to do, and it's only something that happens kind of by accident rather than something that you're aiming to do and setting up. Whereas Chempunk, though, when that happens, you get a very substantial reward, especially in certain matchups where your opponent is playing similar cards that you play that are more powerful, or adding tools to your deck that you previously didn't have that could make a substantial bonus. So like one of the best times that we see Chempunk overperforming is against the Ionia matchups, actually. So when we get our attack on 2, and normally we would play Claws of the Dragon against those decks a lot of the time, provided we didn't have exactly Solitary Monk in our hand, but even then, if we have the attack on 2, sometimes we still do it. We get our opponent's only options in those matchups. Lux Karma is the perfect example. They have Eye of the Dragon. That is their only turn 2 play in the entire deck. So, by playing Chempunk, you've put your opponent in the corner of, do you give me a free value trade on your Eye of the Dragon, which is a pretty good value 2-drop card, and then my Chempunk is still alive, you still have to deal with it, or do you give me a free spell out of your deck? And both of those are horrible for the Lux Karma player. That is definitely not a position that you want to be in, and it's so simple. Against certain matchups, you just play Chempunk on 2, and their options are bad and bad. It's just that, it's as simple as that. And when we don't get the attack on 2, sometimes our open attack on turn 3 is still available in the similar fashion. If our opponent goes Eye of the Dragon and we play Chempunk in response, it goes to turn 3, and now we just open attack with Chempunk, and our opponent's options are exactly the same, except now they might have Will of Ionia open to blast our Chempunk back to our hand, which would be hilariously bad value for our opponent. That is just horrible. The only thing that they can do is just like block. Maybe they play Remembrance that turn. That's really, there's not really a whole lot that they can be doing. It's still just not like great value for them, no matter how it works out. That being said, though, the other main point of that was that we touch back on is the Claws of the Dragon just didn't do enough. That 0 mana just didn't matter, and even more so now, I think it's going to be not like just far less important, because the only time that Claws of the Dragon coming down for 0 was very relevant before was against our Noxus Piltover matchup, that if we could get a cheap blocker in the way, which after playing that matchup a ton, that almost never happens anyway, because you just end up playing the card on turn 2 as a 3/2 blocker. You don't have the time to wait for the 0 mana version of the card. That being said, also about the Demacia matchup, the Demacia matchup is another matchup where you wanted it as just a free chump blocker to buy you some time, because they have incredibly aggressive starts in that deck. But now with a Grizzled Ranger and Badger Bear nerf, we actually have a little bit more time against that deck, and I'm going to go into that next, as our next talking point of those huge nerfs. But that definitely substantially lowers the value of Claws of the Dragon when the two best cases for it are now easier matchups than they were before, and it was already not performing as well as we would have liked it to against those decks before patch 1.2. But moving on, the Grizzled Ranger and Badger Bear nerf. So now Badger Bear and Grizzled Ranger both have 3 attack as opposed to their 4 attack before, and how this kind of lines up for us in our game plan is that a lot of times you just weren't blocking those cards. The best play was often, unless we had Solitary Monk on 3 or Thermogenic Beam on 3 to answer the Badger Bear, it pretty much always just got to hit us in the face. And now that dealing 1 less damage, which is multiple times throughout the game for both of these cards. In Grizzled Ranger, it was the same thing. Usually the first attack always gets to hit you in the face, and then the second attack, you would choose to block the Grizzled Ranger there. That's another life that we save there. And then our opponent might have a Badger Bear or 2 on the following turn, swinging there. We might not be blocking those again. And often the reason we do this is because we have no good answers, so we try to just bank our mana and come back with a huge tempo swing on the turn 5 mark of Vi or Heimerdinger to try to oppose the Demacia starts. But now we have a couple extra life points to play around with at this stage of the game, and that has a substantial impact. You've seen a lot of the Demacia gameplay. A lot of people say like, oh, that was a really close game. Is this matchup actually like good versus Demacia playing Heimerdinger? And most of the time it is. And a lot of people have the misconception of they see our life total when we're playing on stream is like 3 against Demacia or something around there. And then we win the game. And it's just like, wow, that was close. Like, it didn't seem like you were going to win that game. Did you get lucky? Did our opponent get unlucky? This matchup seems terrible, etc. And the thing is that that's how the Demacia game plays out every time, and that's what we're aiming for. You use your health total to your advantage in the early game, take a lot of hits, and then use your Heimerdinger or Vi to start snowballing back into the game. Vi is a good stabilization tool that gets us to our Heimerdinger, but once Heimerdinger sticks on the board against Demacia, as long as you have a way to counter that single combat, it sticks forever, and they never get to attack again. And we say it all the time, we've hit the stage of the game where opponent will never deal damage again. And it has happened time and time and time again. Of our opponent puts us to 3 HP in the Demacia matchup, 2 HP, even 1 HP sometimes, of just understanding that our opponent will need 1 more attack to lethal us, but we never give them the opportunity again. Our Heimerdinger comes down, we start generating unlimited turrets, the deck has incredibly low amounts of interaction in the forms of spell, removal, anything like that, and they never get to deal damage to us again. But the only way that we did this is by surviving by taking face hits early on. And now that those face hits are substantially reduced in the form of Badger Bear and Grizzled Ranger over time, because on average, we took about 3 hits from those cards collectively through the game. I would say the general Demacia game is you take a Badger Bear hit, a Grizzled Ranger hit, and then at least 1 more Badger Bear hit, sometimes 2. So that's 3 to 4 life that we've gained automatically with those nerfs, which is that's like getting a health potion for free every game. And when I'm talking about games where we're often surviving at between 1 and 4 HP and then just stopping our opponent from attacking completely, that's a huge difference. That buys us additional time to get to a Heimerdinger. That could just buy us games in general, because a lot of times when you lose the games, it's like we would die from exact lethal or 1 over right before we were able to stabilize with our Heimerdinger. Also buys us more time to get to something like Vi and Spirit's Refuge to make a very powerful combination to heal ourselves to full. It's another thing that is a very good win strategy against the Demacia deck, is if you can pull off a large Vi with a Spirit's Refuge after, like I said, you took all that face damage in the early game. We almost always heal back up to full off of this. She ends up generally netting you 10. Sometimes she can net you even more if you play around a single combat with it They try to single combat to get your Vi off the board to not get any more value trades. You chain Spirit's Refuge, and then you'll get double the healing by forcing a fight with their one card and then trading on the other card in combat. Another thing that you can do with it is if your Vi gets leveled up, she'll deal additional damage on the attack, dealing 5 extra, which gets you even more bonus off of Spirit's Refuge once she's flipped over. The only thing to be said about that, though, is that now our Vi is a little bit harder to keep alive in those matchups, considering that the 1 less HP means we have a rougher time dealing with those 5 attack cards. But for the most part, we'll still be all right, especially because the Grizzled Ranger and Badger Bear now have less health. We can actually take a hit from one of those and then still take a value trade on one of the Little Cythrias, the Fleet Feather Trackers, or some other cards that pop up in the deck, like War Chefs. There's plenty of times that we can do that, or even just take our trade on a buffed card, now like a Bannerman on a Grizzled Ranger or something like that. We still have the availability to do that, as well as a Badger Bear, and then get an additional trade out of our Vi. But we're looking to just always try to 2-for-1 with her and stabilize, and I think that option will generally always be available. You might just have to attack the weaker card first and then go for your 5/5 value trade after. So the order is slightly changed, but the value is generally still the same. Another change to the deck based off the nerf that I discussed at the beginning of the video is that Deep Meditation now costs 5 instead of 3, and although that 3 cost does give us the access to the elusive, the other part of that is that the additional mana cuts off lines of play through the game. So a typical Heimerdinger curve is we play 2 cards leading up to the turn 4 mark, or between turn 1 and turn 4, and then we attempt to go into turn 5 with 3 spell mana almost every game. Whether this gives you the Twin Disciplines to back up your Vi, or your Heimerdinger is going to pop off on turn 5 because you have some combination of Flash of Brilliance or Twin Disciplines to keep it alive, that's usually your goal. The only time that you don't need 3 spell mana going into turn 5 is when you have Vi and it's looking like you didn't have a Twin Disciplines in hand. You don't need the 3 spell mana to play it. But even that 3 spell mana we've seen time and time again where you want it going into then your turn 6. So even if we're playing Vi on turn 5, not playing something like Twin Disciplines, we're not playing any of our 3 mana spells, it's still nice to have that additional mana going to turn 6 so that now we can play Heimerdinger and we have access to cards like Deny on turn 4 as protection, Spirit's Refuge, even Will of Ionia with our Heimer sometimes if we're trying to play very defensively and get that value because we know that our Heimerdinger is safe. It comes up all the time, and that 3 spell mana carrying over is big. Now, you're thinking, okay, well, what does this have to do with Deep Meditation? Well, it has to do with Deep Meditation because Deep Meditation on turn 4 was actually an incredibly common play for 4 mana. This card, I would say, about 80% of the time when we're playing Heimerdinger is cast for the full 4 mana value, and you're perfectly okay with not getting the cheap version of it. If you had Heimerdinger on board even, that still generates the Fearsome turret, which is one of the more powerful ones, whereas the 5 mana version, the Quick Attack turret is very bad. It's mostly a blocker, actually more than an attacker, which is ironic because you would think Quick Attack 5/1 attack, that's an attacker. That's a card that has high value on the attack turn. But the thing is most of the time that gets chump blocked, and we're not trying to actually like go into combat with cards. We're trying to use Fearsome and Elusive cards to hit our opponent in the face uncontested. And then we use our turrets as blockers on the following turn after they've gotten their damage out. So the 5/1 is usually a good blocker, and we don't attempt to go to combat on our own turn. That being said, though, on turn 4, this is a very common play, which would leave us with exactly 3 spell mana. That play is no longer an option, so if you wanted to Deep Meditation before going into your Heimerdinger turn, you no longer have access to Twin Disciplines, Flash of Brilliance, and these were the most important cards that we would actually be fishing for with our Deep Med. On turn 4, we're like, okay, this is a perfect time to play our Deep Med. We don't need to play anything here because our turn 3 was Solitary Monk, and then we had our 3 spell mana banked. Like, we skip turn 1, we skip turn 2, we play Monk, we have 3 spell mana, we go into turn 4, we now have 4 regular mana, 3 spell mana, Deep Med. I would say almost every time the Deep Med was in our opening hand, with Solitary Monk, this was generally the line of play unless our opponent had a very aggressive early start. And then this would set you up to just find your spells or thin your deck out to get to your Heimerdinger even if you didn't have it. Same thing with Vi, trying to get to those cards. It's still a good way to thin your deck out and spend your mana at that time appropriately, and then still have that 3 spell mana banked, provided that you can move into those turns with those champions. So that line of play is gone, and that's huge. Specifically, the turn 4 Deep Meditation play is a substantial difference now that we only have 2 mana afterwards. We might see cards like Key Guardian actually becoming even more powerful if Deep Meditation plus Key Guardian is our turn 4 play, and we're going to just try to play our Heimerdinger with just Barrier more often, depending on how the meta shifts. That could be just a more common play, or maybe we're just going to be holding our Deep Meds for late game the majority of the time, and I think that's going to be the more common scenario. And we're going to really have to try to set this card up for the 2 spell reduction, whereas we didn't have to try as hard to do that before. That being said, though, once we go to the late game, this card is definitely better than it was before, costing 3 mana in that late game scenario where you have Heimerdinger. So our opposition, the other decks that are using Deep Meditation, definitely it was just strictly a nerf. There's no upside to it. Now for us, though, we do get the silver lining of in the late game, when we already have our Heimerdinger established and we can start going for, like, say on turn 5, we play Heimerdinger and we play double flash, or we play Heimerdinger flash and then we use Twin Disciplines to protect our Heimerdinger, or we're playing against a deck where our opponent doesn't have any way to kill our guy, so we ended up just playing a Get Excited, shooting the face and trying to push for aggression on top of our flash. We can set up so that on our turn 6 that we end up playing Deep Meditation and then maybe still having the mana open to play some of these aforementioned 3 mana spells. And then also generating our elusive turret out of that is very powerful. Moving on past that turn 6 mark, though, it should be a little bit easier to set up the 2 spell Deep Meditation and then often get your elusive turrets out of this, which do substantially more than the 2/1 turrets would have done before. So overall, this is a nerf. I don't like that everyone's like, oh, it's strictly a buff, it's strictly broken. It's obviously better because the card was activated for 4 mana so much. However, this deck specifically does get a silver lining. Now, on the topic of nerfs, one of the biggest one was the Noxus Piltover nerfs. So Legion Rearguard is now a 3/1 instead of a 3/2, and Boom Crew Rookie is now a 1/3 instead of a 1/4. And what this means for our deck is our turn 1s can no longer go wrong if we mulligan for Thermogenic Beam. And I've said this plenty of times on stream of, when we play against the burn deck, the card that we are looking for more than anything, and we will generally throw our entire hand for, is Thermogenic Beam, because it can kill any turn 1 play in the deck besides Rearguard, or at least it could before, and now it kills all of them. And when your opponent doesn't deal damage to you on turn 1 with the Noxus Piltover deck, and also loses one of their guys, uses up that mana there, and we just trade 1 for 1, that increases your win rate substantially against that deck. And then also moving forward to turn 2 now, with Boom Crew Rookie only being a 1/3, our mulligan, we generally keep Chempunk. Chempunk and Thermogenic Beam are your 2 best keeps against that deck, and we'll pretty much throw every card for specifically those 2. Chempunk can actually trade on everything that the opponent can play on turn 2. Before, it couldn't trade on the Boom Crew Rookie, pretty much guaranteeing the Boom Crew Rookie always dealt 4 to your face. It was nearly impossible to stop. The only way that didn't happen was if you played Solitary Monk, because they had the attack token on 3. So they have a Boom Crew Rookie, they play a guy, or they play the Boom Crew on 3, we play our Solitary Monk, and we block it. But generally, this doesn't feel great, as our block on Boom Crew Rookie prevents less damage than blocking another card, because by blocking Boom Crew Rookie, we often let something with, say, 2 or 3 attack get through, like the Rearguard that they might have started with, one of the 2/3s even that we could also get a value trade on. So it doesn't feel good blocking the Boom Crew, but you know the thing's going to hit you for 2 again. Now we have more options to answer with the Thermogenic Beam on turn 2 or the Chempunk. These are 2. The win rate is going to shift substantially when you mulligan correctly against this deck now. And the other thing too is that was our hardest matchup by far. Pretty much every other matchup for Heimerdinger Vi was not really a problem. There were certain decks that had a lot of answers to what we could do. So we had decks like Ez Karma, we had decks like Arena Control that did have a lot of removal for our turrets and ways to get rid of our Heimerdinger as well. But those were never bad matchups, they just weren't good matchups. And what I mean by that is that they were pretty close to 50-50. It was very dependent on how the draws panned out, how quickly we draw our Heimerdinger, and also the player skill. There was a high impact on player skill in those matchups. That definitely could be watered down by draws. If we just never saw Heimerdinger against a deck like that, it can happen against any deck, as well as if your opponent just draws the perfect curve in a deck like Karina, and you just don't draw the answers. Like if they Brood Awakening you didn't find Deny, if they Vi you and you didn't find the answer to a Vi, or just start Elise and you didn't get your answer to your Elise in your opening hand, which against those decks, the things I recommend that you look for is an answer to Elise, a Deny, and a Heimerdinger. Those are your most important things, of just being able to stop that early aggression and find your Heimerdinger. But like I said, we didn't have bad matchups. We just had close matchups. The only bad matchup was Noxus Piltover, and not only did the deck get easier to beat I believe that our opponents will often just not be playing them. The play rate of that deck, I guarantee, will go down now. I imagine people will be less inclined to try it, or continue to play it. Maybe some people will be trying it day one because they would just want to see if the deck is still good, which it is. Noctis Piltover is still a strong deck. However, it is definitely had a good chunk taken out of its power level, being able to answer its early curve, because there were no great answers for Rearguard on 1, and there were no great answers for Boom Crew on 2. And so now that you can actually kind of answer everything progressing through the curve, it should be a lot easier to combat. I just on the play rate alone going down, though, I think we're going to it seems like free reign for Heimer to become the best deck now. I want to say that I can say that confidently, but I can't confirm that 100% because we don't know where the meta is going to go. But I'm pretty sure this is the safe bet for best deck, and a lot of people were wondering, like, is it going to be the best deck? Are other decks just going to become more prevalent? Is Lux Karma still just really good? I would say overall, given that you don't really have any bad matchups besides Noctis Piltover, this deck is going to be the king deck. This is definitely an S tier without a doubt. Probably the best deck, but only time will tell. We'll see where the meta shifts, and we might even be making some adjustments, like I said, of maybe including Karma back into our deck. We might see some new decks pop up before that just we didn't even know about that might have interesting matchups with Heimer Vibe, but generally speaking, especially early on, if you're looking to climb and take advantage of people kind of scrambling to try new decks today, tomorrow, and the first few days of patch, people always like to try new stuff. Heimer Vi is a very safe bet because it has a very good matchup against rogue decks, and kind of just not anything that's not hyper aggressive, you should beat majority of the time. Like, the only way it usually goes wrong, even in your control matchups, is when they hyper aggro you, which is hilarious to think, but the only time that you would lose to a deep deck with this deck is when they started like triple dredgers or double dredgers into Jaw Hunters or the Lifesteal guy, and they started really early curve. And one of the main times you lose to Karina control is when they're able to get the early Elise and Rude Awakening that you can't respond to. So as long as the meta shifts away from aggro, which I think it will, I'm pretty sure that people are probably still going to play Demacia. I think that deck is still strong. Like I said before, that extra life advantage that we're going to gain is definitely substantial. But I think a lot of people are going to try slower decks. They're going to want to try these new cards out. They're going to, we might even be seeing like slot bot decks and Bilgewater, because that card got a pretty substantial nerf. I don't know if that's going to be a huge thing. I guarantee we're going to see a lot of Vlad decks on ladder. And this deck has a great matchup against all of those. Any deck that is not hyper aggressive, we're going to just do fine against, especially against unrefined strategies that have kind of loose builds. They might not have the fully optimized kit of spells to deal with a variety of matchups in the form of like having the proper removal spells or just the right numbers on certain things. So I would definitely put this as my bet for number one deck moving forward. I think that's about it though for the patch 1.2 changes. I hope you guys really enjoyed this. Please ask any questions that you have. I love talking about this deck. It's definitely my favorite deck, and we're definitely going to keep playing it into patch 1.2. Any changes that we have moving forward are definitely going to be updated on our Mobalytics decks. You can find them all down in the description. We have the Deco down in the description below. We have all of our socials, our Discord, our Twitch. Make sure to check it out. And also, if you're looking how to just improve your Heimer game overall from start to finish of a game and the general strategies before patch 1.2, but still about 90% of that video is applicable to now, I would check out our other video, also going to be linked in the description below. Thank you guys so much. Definitely stay tuned for more content coming out. See you later.